The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his goggles and prepared for what would become the most decisive naval battle in American history. It was June 4th, 1942, and the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before him. Hiding beneath its deceptively calm surface the greatest naval armada Japan had ever assembled. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Chester Nimitz knew that the Imperial Japanese Navy was planning something massive. The intelligence intercepts had been pouring in for weeks, decoded messages revealing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's audacious plan to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a trap at Midway Atoll. What the Japanese didn't know was that Commander Joseph Rockford and his team of cryptographers at Station Hypo had cracked their naval code, giving the Americans an unprecedented advantage in what would become known as the Battle of Midway. The Japanese plan was breathtakingly ambitious. Yamamoto intended to use a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, while simultaneously launching a massive assault on Midway Island with 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The strategy was designed to force the Americans into a decisive battle, where Japan's superior numbers and experienced pilots would crush what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Admiral Nimitz, however, had different plans. Despite having only 3 aircraft carriers against Japan's 4, he positioned Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, northeast of Midway. The American forces included the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, along with their escorts of cruisers and destroyers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. On Midway Island itself, Marine and Navy personnel prepared for the inevitable assault. Major Lofton Henderson's Marine Fighter Squadron 211 stood ready, with their outdated Brewster Buffaloes, while the island's defensive positions bristled with anti-aircraft guns and coastal artillery. As dawn broke on June 4th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, lifted off from the carrier Akagi. 108 bombers and fighters streaked toward Midway, their engines creating a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ocean. The attack was devastating, but not decisive. American radar operators had detected the incoming formation, and Marine fighters rose to meet them in a desperate aerial battle above the Coral Atoll. The initial Japanese assault, while causing significant damage to Midway's facilities, failed to neutralize the island's defenses completely. More critically for the Japanese, it set in motion a series of events that would expose their fleet to American counterattack. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, faced a crucial decision. Should he launch a second strike against Midway, or prepare his aircraft to engage the American fleet that his reconnaissance planes had finally located? This moment of hesitation would prove fatal, as Nagumo's crews frantically rearmed their aircraft, switching from land attack bombs to anti-ship torpedoes. American dive bombers were already racing across the Pacific toward the Japanese fleet. The trap that Yamamoto had so carefully laid for the Americans was about to be sprung on his own forces, and the course of World War II hung in the balance. The morning of June 4th had begun with Japanese confidence running high, but by 10:30 a.m., the tide of battle was shifting in ways that would have seemed impossible just hours before. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, was about to make a sacrifice that would echo through naval history. Flying the lumbering Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, Waldron and his 15 aircrew members approached the Japanese fleet, knowing they were flying into almost certain death. The Devastators were slow, poorly armed, and required them to fly straight and level for their torpedo runs, making them sitting ducks for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. As they began their attack on the carrier Kaga, Admiral Nagumo's combat air patrol of Mitsubishi Zero fighters fell upon them like wolves. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down. Waldron's aircraft burst into flames and plummeted into the Pacific. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 Devastators were destroyed, with only Ensign George Gay surviving by clinging to a seat cushion in the oil-slicked water. The attack had been a tactical disaster, but it served a crucial strategic purpose. It drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high altitude clear for the American dive bombers that were approaching from the northeast. According to historical accounts from the Naval History and Heritage Command, this sacrifice by Torpedo Squadron 8 created the opening that would change the course of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet just as their fighters were climbing back to altitude after massacring the torpedo bombers. At exactly 10:20 a.m., McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. "Attack! Attack!" The American dive bombers rolled into their steep attack dives, screaming down through the morning sky toward the Japanese carriers. The timing was perfect. The Japanese flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, creating a powder keg waiting for a spark. The first bombs struck the carrier Kaga with devastating effect. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading the Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6, put his 1,000-pound bomb directly into the carrier's forward elevator. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and ammunition, creating an inferno that spread rapidly across the flight deck. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a blazing wreck. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, were attacking the carrier Soryu. The Japanese carrier, caught with its aircraft refueling, suffered multiple direct hits that turned her into a floating crematorium. The ship's captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, chose to go down with his vessel, a decision that epitomized the Japanese warrior code but could not save his ship or crew. The attack on the Akagi was equally devastating. Rear Admiral Nagumo's flagship, the carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was struck by multiple bombs that penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangar below. The ship's communication systems were destroyed, forcing Nagumo to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara and continue commanding the battle from their dot in the span of just 6 minutes. 3 of Japan's fleet carriers had been mortally wounded. The Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, managed to launch a counterattack against the American fleet. Under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the Hiryu's aircraft found and attacked the USS Yorktown, scoring hits that forced the carrier to abandon ship temporarily. However, the damage was done. The Japanese had lost 3/4 of their carrier strength, along with most of their experienced pilots and aircrew. The careful planning and months of preparation had been undone in minutes by American courage, superior intelligence, and a healthy dose of luck. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that Admiral Yamamoto's grand strategy had not only failed, but had resulted in one of the most decisive defeats in naval history. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the Pacific as the sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, prepared to strike back with the desperation of a cornered animal. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his tactical brilliance and unwavering courage, stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching smoke columns rise from his 3 sister ships. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were dying, their steel hulls twisted and blackened by American bombs. But Yamaguchi was not ready to concede defeat. At 1:30 p.m., the Hiryu launched her first retaliatory strike. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet, their engines roaring with mechanical fury. The Japanese pilots, among the most experienced in the Imperial Navy, flew with the knowledge that they were likely on a one-way mission. Their target was the USS Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, which had been spotted by reconnaissance aircraft earlier that morning. The attack on the Yorktown was executed with the precision and ferocity that had made the Japanese Navy feared throughout the Pacific. Kobayashi's dive bombers screamed down through heavy anti-aircraft fire, their bombs finding their mark on the American carrier's flight deck. The explosions knocked out the ship's boilers, leaving her dead in the water and listing to port. Damage control parties rushed to contain the flooding and restore power. but the Yorktown appeared to be finished. However, the American damage control teams, led by Commander Clarence Aldrich, performed what many would later call a miracle of naval engineering. Within 2 hours, they had restored enough power to get the Yorktown underway at 20 knots. The carrier's flight deck was patched, and aircraft were once again landing and taking off. To Japanese pilots flying overhead, it appeared as though a completely different ship had taken the Yorktown's place. This illusion proved costly for the Japanese. At 2:45 p.m., the Hiryu launched her second and final strike, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway Island. Tomonaga's aircraft had been damaged in the earlier mission, and his fuel tank was leaking. But he insisted on leading the attack despite knowing he would not return. The 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters found what they believed to be a fresh American carrier and pressed home their attack with suicidal determination. The second attack on the Yorktown was even more devastating than the first. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, causing massive flooding and knocking out all power. The ship took on a severe list, and Captain Elliot Buckmaster reluctantly gave the order to abandon ship. The Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea and countless other actions, appeared to be sinking. Tomonaga's aircraft, true to his prediction, never returned to the Hiryu. But even as the Japanese celebrated their apparent victory, American retribution was already airborne. At 3:30 p.m., 24 SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, spotted the Hiryu steaming frantically northward. The Japanese carrier, caught with aircraft refueling on her flight deck, suffered the same fate as her sister ships, for direct hits transformed the Hiryu into a blazing wreck. Her flight deck crumpled, and her hangar spaces filled with exploding ammunition. Admiral Yamaguchi, realizing that his ship was doomed, made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than transfer his flag to another vessel, he chose to remain aboard the Hiryu and share the fate of his men. In a message to Admiral Yamamoto, he took full responsibility for the defeat and requested that the lessons learned be used to improve future operations. As flames consumed his flagship, Yamaguchi stood on the bridge, singing the Japanese national anthem with his surviving crew members. The destruction of the Hiryu marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. In one day, the Imperial Navy had lost for fleet carriers over 100 aircraft and thousands of experienced pilots and aircrew. The carefully built expertise that had made Pearl Harbor possible was gone, scattered across the Pacific floor. Meanwhile, the Americans had lost only one carrier, the Yorktown, and had proven that their industrial capacity and fighting spirit could overcome even the most carefully planned enemy operations. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished naval career. Standing in the operations room of the super battleship Yamato, the architect of Pearl Harbor studied the damage reports streaming in from the Midway operation. For fleet carriers destroyed, over 100 aircraft lost, and thousands of his most experienced pilots dead or missing, the magnitude of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Yamamoto had spent months planning this operation, believing that a decisive victory at Midway would force the Americans to negotiate a peace settlement. The Japanese combined fleet had assembled the largest naval force in its history: 11 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 21 submarines. Even with the carrier losses, Yamamoto still commanded overwhelming surface superiority, and he briefly considered pressing forward with a night battle using his massive battleships. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's chief of staff, advocated for continuing the attack. The American fleet, he argued, was vulnerable after the day's fighting, and the Japanese still held significant advantages in night combat techniques and torpedo warfare. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, each mounting 9 18-inch guns, could devastate any American surface force that dared to engage them. A night action might still salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. However, Yamamoto understood what many of his subordinates did not. The nature of naval warfare had fundamentally changed. The day's events had proven that aircraft carriers, not battleships, were now the decisive weapons in naval combat. Without air cover, his magnificent battleships would be nothing more than expensive targets for American dive bombers. When dawn broke, the gamble that had begun with such promise had failed catastrophically. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that would echo through naval history. Occupation of Midway is canceled. The combined fleet would withdraw to the west, abandoning the operation that was supposed to end American resistance in the Pacific. The decision was met with stunned silence from his staff officers, many of whom had never witnessed a Japanese retreat. The withdrawal, however, was not without its own drama. The heavy cruiser Mikuma, damaged in a collision with her sister ship Megami during the confused night retirement, was caught by American aircraft the following morning. Captain Richard Fleming, leading Marine dive bombers from Midway, pressed home his attack despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. Fleming's aircraft was hit and burst into flames, but he continued his dive, crashing into the Mikuma's after turret in a final act of defiance that helped sink the Japanese cruiser. Meanwhile, the battered Yorktown, abandoned but still afloat, had become the center of a dramatic rescue operation. The destroyer USS Hammond came alongside the listing carrier, and salvage teams worked frantically to restore power and patch the torpedo damage. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Yorktown might be saved, but the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had other plans. On June 6th, Tanabe's submarine penetrated the American screen and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the Yorktown to struck the carrier, delivering the final blow to the ship that had survived both Coral Sea and Midway. 1 torpedo also struck the Hammond, breaking the destroyer's back and sinking her with heavy loss of life. The Yorktown rolled over and sank the following morning, taking with her the last major American loss of the battle. The sinking of the Yorktown provided some small consolation to the Japanese, but it could not mask the strategic disaster that had befallen the Imperial Navy. Yamamoto's gamble had not only failed, but had crippled Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations for the remainder of the war. The admiral who had warned his government that he could run wild for 6 months after Pearl Harbor had reached the end of that period, and the initiative in the Pacific had passed irreversibly to the Americans. As the Japanese fleet limped back toward home waters, carrying the wounded and the survivors of 4 proud aircraft carriers, the reality of the defeat began to sink in. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War, had been shattered. In the span of a single day, the rising sun flag still flew over much of the Pacific, but its light was already beginning to fade. The waters around Midway Island had become a graveyard of ships and dreams, but amidst the wreckage floated stories of heroism that would inspire generations of naval aviators. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, clung to his life raft in the oil-slicked Pacific, watching history unfold around him. For over 10 hours, he floated among the debris of the Japanese fleet, witnessing the destruction of the Kaga from what may have been the closest vantage point of any American serviceman. Gay's survival was nothing short of miraculous. When his TBD Devastator was shot down during the morning attack, he had managed to inflate his life raft and hide beneath his seat cushion as Japanese fighters strafed the water around him. From his position, he watched the American dive bombers arrive and devastate the Japanese carriers. His radio worked intermittently, allowing him to hear the excited voices of American pilots as they scored hit after hit on the enemy fleet. The heroism displayed at Midway extended far beyond individual acts of courage. On the carrier Enterprise, aviation machinist mate First Class Bruno Gato had already distinguished himself during the February 1st raid on the Marshall Islands, when he had manned a rear-seat machine gun and helped shoot down a Japanese bomber. At Midway, Gato flew as radioman gunner in Lieutenant Commander Richard Best's dive bomber during the attack. On the Akagi, his accurate fire helped protect the bomber formation from Japanese fighters, contributing directly to the successful attack. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading the Yorktown's dive bombers, exemplified the technical skill and tactical innovation that made American naval aviation so effective. Despite an electrical malfunction that caused his dive bomber to accidentally drop its bomb before reaching the target, Leslie continued to lead his squadron's attack on the Soryu, using his aircraft's machine guns to suppress Japanese anti-aircraft fire. He helped coordinate the attack that sent the Japanese carrier to the bottom. The story of Captain Richard Fleming and his Marine dive bombers illustrated the multi-service nature of the American victory. Flying from Henderson Field on Midway Island, Fleming's squadron of SPD Dauntless aircraft pursued the retreating Japanese fleet on June 5th. When his aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire and burst into flames, Fleming had the choice to bail out or continue his attack. He chose to dive his burning aircraft into the heavy cruiser Mikuma, his sacrifice helping to sink the Japanese warship and demonstrating that the spirit of sacrifice was not limited to any single service. The technical crews who kept the aircraft flying deserve equal recognition with the pilots who flew them. Chief Aviation Machinist's mate John Ike, working on the Enterprise's flight deck, directed the rapid rearming and refueling of aircraft between strikes. Despite coming under Japanese air attack, Ike and his crew maintained their positions, ensuring that American aircraft could continue their assault on the Japanese fleet. Their work often went unrecognized, but it was essential to the victory. Among the Japanese forces, acts of courage and sacrifice were equally common. Though they could not alter the outcome of the battle, Captain Jisaku Okada of the carrier Kaga remained on his bridge as his ship burned around him, directing damage control efforts until the end. Admiral Yamaguchi's decision to remain aboard the Hiryu became a symbol of Japanese naval tradition, though it also highlighted the fatalistic thinking that would handicap Japanese strategy. For the remainder of the war, the intelligence officers who made the victory possible also deserved recognition. Commander Joseph Rockford and his team at Station Hypo had worked tirelessly to decode Japanese communications, often working 18-hour days in the underground facility at Pearl Harbor. Their breakthrough in cracking the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25, provided Admiral Nimitz with the strategic intelligence that made the ambush possible. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, had staked his career on the accuracy of the intelligence reports about Japanese intentions. When he briefed Nimitz on the expected timing and direction of the Japanese attack, he was essentially betting that his analysis was correct. The accuracy of his predictions vindicated the American intelligence effort and demonstrated the crucial role that code-breaking would play throughout the Pacific War. These individual stories of heroism and sacrifice combined to create a victory that transcended mere tactical success. The Battle of Midway became a testament to American industrial capacity, strategic intelligence, tactical innovation, and individual courage. It marked the moment when the United States Navy came of age as a global force, ready to carry the war to the enemy across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The aftermath of the Battle of Midway rippled across the Pacific like shock waves, from a massive underwater explosion, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of World War II. In Tokyo, the Japanese government struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the defeat while simultaneously concealing it from their own people. The official communiqué claimed a great victory, announcing the sinking of 2 American carriers and heavy damage to Midway's facilities, while making no mention of the 4 replaceable fleet carriers that now lay on the Pacific floor. Emperor Hirohito, receiving private briefings from Navy Minister Shigetaro Shimada, understood the true scope of the disaster. The loss of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu represented more than just ships and aircraft. It was the destruction of Japan's most experienced naval aviation cadre. The pilots who had trained for years in the rigorous Japanese system, who had perfected their skills in the crucible of combat over China, were gone forever. Japan's naval aviation would never recover from this single day's losses. Admiral Yamamoto, bearing the weight of responsibility for the defeat, submitted his resignation to the Naval General Staff. The resignation was refused, but the admirals Health began to deteriorate under the stress of the failure. His staff noted that he became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours staring at the ocean from the bridge of the Yamato. The man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor and given Japan its string of early victories was now faced with the impossible task of defending an overextended empire with diminishing resources. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt and his military advisors recognized immediately that Midway represented a fundamental shift in Pacific strategy. General George Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, despite their frequent disagreements about resource allocation between the European and Pacific theaters, agreed that the victory provided an opportunity to seize the initiative. The planned defensive strategy of holding Hawaii and the West Coast could now be abandoned in favor of offensive operations designed to push the Japanese back across the Pacific. The industrial implications of the victory were equally significant. American shipyards, already working at unprecedented capacity, received orders for a massive expansion of carrier construction. The Essex-class carriers, larger and more capable than their predecessors, would soon begin rolling off the production lines in numbers that would dwarf Japanese capacity. The Battle of Midway had not only eliminated Japan's carrier superiority, but had also demonstrated that American industrial might could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the quiet strategist who had orchestrated the victory, found himself elevated to the status of national hero. His calm demeanor and strategic acumen had enabled him to position his forces perfectly for the battle, but he remained characteristically modest about his role. In his post-battle report, he emphasized the courage of the pilots and aircrew who had executed the attacks, stating that the real credit belongs to the boys who flew the planes. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the Pacific. Adolf Hitler, observing the Japanese defeat from his headquarters in East Prussia, began to doubt his allies' ability to maintain pressure on the United States. The German leader had hoped that Japanese success in the Pacific would prevent significant American reinforcement of the European theater. Midway demonstrated that American industrial capacity was sufficient to fight effectively on two fronts simultaneously. For the men who had fought the battle, the victory brought both satisfaction and sorrow. The surviving pilots of the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown Air Groups were quickly promoted and assigned to training duties, passing their hard-won experience to the next generation of naval aviators. Many would never again experience the intensity and clarity of purpose that had characterized those crucial hours over the Pacific. The Battle of Midway also marked the beginning of the end for battleship-centered naval strategy. The decisive factor in the battle had been aircraft carriers and their embarked air groups, not the massive gun platforms that had dominated naval thinking for decades. The implications were not lost on naval strategists worldwide, who began to reorient their thinking around aviation and amphibious warfare. As June ended and July began, the full scope of the American victory became clear. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been crippled, perhaps permanently. The initiative had passed to the United States, and with it came the responsibility to carry the war to the enemy. The long road to Tokyo Bay had begun, and it would be paved with the lessons learned in the waters around a small coral atoll named Midway. The morning of June 7, 1942, dawned quietly over the Pacific, but the world had changed forever as rescue vessels combed the waters around Midway Island, pulling survivors from life rafts and debris fields. The magnitude of what had transpired began to crystallize in the minds of military leaders on both sides of the Pacific. The Battle of Midway had lasted only for days, but its consequences would echo through the remainder of World War II and beyond. In the immediate aftermath, both nations faced the sobering task of accounting for their losses. The United States had lost the carrier Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, 145 aircraft, and 307 servicemen. The Japanese losses were staggering by comparison. For fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 skilled naval personnel. But the numbers only told part of the story. Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific, and with it, any realistic hope of forcing a negotiated peace with the United States. The immediate strategic consequences became apparent within weeks. The planned Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled, relieving pressure on Australia and New Zealand. The Japanese advance across the Central Pacific had been halted, providing American forces with breathing room to consolidate their defenses and prepare for offensive operations. Most significantly, the destruction of Japan's carrier-based aviation eliminated the mobile striking force that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had commanded Task Force 16 during the battle, emerged as one of the conflict's most capable flag officers. His decision to withdraw eastward on the evening of June 4th, rather than pursue the Japanese fleet into a potential night action, demonstrated the strategic thinking that would characterize American naval leadership for the remainder of the war. Spruance understood that preserving American forces was more important than achieving a marginally greater tactical victory. The technological lessons learned at Midway would influence naval aviation development for decades. The effectiveness of dive bombing against enemy carriers led to improved bomb designs and attack techniques. The vulnerability of torpedo bombers to fighter attack prompted the development of better escort fighters and coordinated attack tactics. The crucial role of radar in detecting incoming air attacks accelerated the deployment of improved detection systems throughout the Pacific Fleet. Perhaps most significantly, Midway demonstrated the decisive importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The code-breaking efforts of Station Hypo had provided Admiral Nimitz with strategic intelligence that enabled him to position his forces for maximum effectiveness. The success of the American intelligence effort led to expanded cryptographic operations and the integration of signals intelligence into strategic planning at the highest levels. The battle also marked the emergence of a new generation of American naval heroes. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to continue searching for the Japanese fleet had led to the discovery of the enemy carriers, became a symbol of pilot determination and skill. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, returned to the United States to help train new torpedo bomber crews, ensuring that the lessons of Midway would be passed to future generations of naval aviators. For Japan, the defeat at Midway marked the beginning of a long strategic retreat. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War, had been shattered. The Imperial Navy would never again possess the strength to conduct major offensive operations, and Japanese strategy shifted to a defensive posture based on fortified island strongpoints. The remainder of the Pacific War would be characterized by American amphibious assaults against increasingly desperate Japanese defenders. The American home front received news of the victory with jubilation, but military censors carefully controlled the information released to the public. The full scope of the Japanese defeat was not revealed until after the war, as intelligence officials feared that detailed accounts might compromise ongoing code-breaking efforts. Nevertheless, the victory at Midway provided a crucial morale boost for Americans who had endured months of bad news from the Pacific. As the years passed and the Pacific War continued its bloody course through the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippines, and ultimately to Japan itself, the Battle of Midway would be remembered as the turning point. Military historians would debate the tactical details and strategic implications for decades, but the fundamental significance remained clear. A small force of American naval aviators had changed the course of history in the span of a few crucial hours. The courage displayed by men like Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, Captain Richard Fleming, and Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi transcended national boundaries and became part of the larger story of human valor in the face of overwhelming odds. Their sacrifice and determination, multiplied across thousands of individual acts of heroism, had created a victory that would resonate through the ages. The Battle of Midway stands as a testament to the power of intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking in warfare. It demonstrated that numerical superiority could be overcome by superior planning and execution, and that the outcome of modern warfare often depends as much on the quality of information as on the quality of weapons. Most importantly, It showed that free societies, when threatened, could mobilize both their material resources and their human spirit to achieve victory. Against seemingly impossible odds, the thunder of engines and the crash of bombs that echoed across the Pacific on those for days in June 1942 announced the dawn of a new era in naval warfare and the beginning of the end. For the Japanese Empire, the Battle of Midway had indeed redefined naval warfare, and its lessons would influence maritime strategy for generations to come.